They took everything from him, except the one thing they never thought to count. His name was Kale. That was the name his mother had given him, whispered over a cot in a transit settlement. On the outskirts of what had once been Chennai, in the 5th year of the occupation, he had never known his father. He had lost his sister, Ronnie, when he was 9 years old, taken in the middle of the night by the Velhari Reclamation Corps, which was what the alien administration called the process of separating human children, deemed high neurological value, from their families, and routing them into processing programs whose real purposes were never disclosed. The official term was reassignment. The word humans used was different, and it had only 2 syllables, and it tasted like ash. For 16 years after that night, Kale lived the way water lives, finding the lowest ground, moving through cracks in the system, surviving. He picked through scrap heaps at the edges of Velhari infrastructure sites. He slept in the ruins of old concrete buildings the aliens had not yet demolished. Buildings that still had Tamil lettering above their doors. He ate what he could find, and he traded what he could spare, and he never for a single day stopped looking for Ronnie. He kept a photograph. It was creased through the middle, and the cultures had gone strange. A kind of sepia that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the stand. Chemicals in the air near the extraction zones, but her face was still clear. A child's face. Gap-toothed, laughing at something off-camera. She had their mother's eyes. He showed it to everyone. The other scavengers. The human traders who worked the gray markets under the transit bridges. People who moved in the quiet places between alien oversight and human desperation. He showed it, and he asked. And the answer was almost always silence, or a look that meant they knew something they were too afraid to say. That was his life. That was the whole of it. Until the night the Velhari took him too. They came without warning, the way they always did. 3 of them in suppression rigs. The kind that folded around the torso and made human muscle useless in under 4 seconds. He had been sleeping under a culvert near the old port district when the charge hit. He woke up in a transport bay with his wrists locked in ceramic restraints, and a Velhari medic leaning over him with instruments he had no names for. The medic's name, he would later learn, was Shiv Ka. The Velhari had 3-syllable designations that humans had mostly learned to shorten. The 2 who had organized his capture were Aravan and Elango. These were the names their human intermediaries used. The names that appeared in the gray market contracts that made the whole operation technically legible under Occupation Administrative Code. What they had planned was this. A man named Vijay, human wealthy by the standards of the occupation economy, the kind of wealthy that meant you had enough Velhari currency units to maintain a private residence and a small staff, and enough of the right connections to exist in the space between collaborator and survivor, was dying, not from disease, from the fact that he had accumulated too much, and the 3 men who stood to inherit from him had grown impatient. The Velhari medical technology available on the black market included, among other things, a procedure called neural transference, a complete mapping and migration of human consciousness from one biological substrate to another. The Velhari used it on their own kind. Some of their surgeons had performed it on humans, for the right price. The plan was elegant, in a way that Kale, once he understood it, could almost admire for its sheer coldness. They would transfer Vijay's consciousness into an empty vessel, a body that could be controlled, managed, disposed of if necessary. They would install in Vijay's body a consciousness they owned. Someone from the margins, someone with no legal standing, no connections, no one who would ask questions. A scavenger, a beggar, a human who had been invisible so long that disappearing him would make no measurable difference to the world. What they would gain was total control over Vijay's estate, his accounts, his identity. The man in Vijay's body would do as he was told, or the man in the other body would suffer. It was leverage as architecture. They chose Kale because his neural profile matched. In the Velhari medical assessments, certain human minds registered with a particular signature, something the Velhari called depth resonance, translated approximately as the quality of a consciousness that had been shaped by long-sustained grief. Apparently, this made transfer easier. Apparently, sorrow was a kind of preparation. He didn't know any of this when the lights went out. He woke up in a room with white walls and a ceiling too high and a body that was not his. The first thing he noticed was the weight. Not heaviness, the opposite. Vijay's body was well-fed, well-rested, chemically regulated to something approaching health. After 16 years in his own body, which had been hungry more often than not, this felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. He kept expecting pain in his left knee, an old scavenger's injury, and finding none. He kept expecting the background ache of malnutrition, the slight tremor in his hands from too much stimulant and not enough protein, and found instead that his hands were steady and clean and the nails were trimmed. He sat up. He looked in the mirror, on the wall opposite the bed. He looked at the face for a long time. Then Aravan came in and told him how it was going to be. Aravan was the one who did the talking. He was tall, thin, with a kind of controlled smoothness that KL recognized from the human administrators who worked the Velhari intermediary offices. People who had learned to perform Kisum as a survival mechanism and had eventually forgotten they were performing. He laid out the arrangement with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who has no choice. KL would inhabit Vijay's life. He would appear at the necessary functions, sign the necessary documents, maintain the necessary face. In exchange, he would be comfortable, safe, and alive. And if I refuse, KL said. His voice was different. He hadn't expected that. He kept calibrating against it. Aravan looked at him for a moment. You have no one, he said. No documentation, no record of existence prior to this room. You are whatever we say you are. The body you're wearing is registered. The body you came from is not. That's the situation. KL thought about Ronnie. He thought about the photograph, which was somewhere, in his old coat, which was somewhere he would never find it. He said, all right. The adjustment was slow and strange and shot through with small violences he had not anticipated. The apartment was enormous by any human standard. 11 rooms, high windows looking out over what had once been a harbor and was now a Velhari logistics hub, all lights and geometric scaffolding. There were human staff, a cook, 2 assistants, a woman named Hema, who was Vijay's partner, and who looked at him on the first morning with an expression he couldn't read. Something between warmth and careful watchfulness, the look of someone who knows a thing is slightly wrong but cannot say why. He did not know how to move through wealth. He had never learned. The table manners were an archaeology he had to piece together from context. You spoke to people when you had leverage over them was something he found he could not perform convincingly, and so he stopped performing it, produced its own kind of confusion in the people around him. The assistants expecting condescension and receiving instead direct questions. Cook expecting to be invisible and finding instead that the man in the apartment wanted to know where the food had come from and whether she had eaten today. He made mistakes. Small ones mostly, gaps in Vijay's personal history he could not fill, references to shared memories he didn't have, particular way of holding a stylus that Vijay's secretary noticed and said nothing about, but noted. He learned to paper over the gaps with vagueness. He learned that wealthy men are often assumed to be distracted, and distraction can cover a great deal. At night, he lay in the too soft bed and felt the strangeness of his own thoughts in the unfamiliar skull and thought about Ronnie, had nothing, no clue, no thread. The photograph was gone, all his informants, the whole quiet network of people he had spent years building in the scrap markets and the transit corridors, inaccessible to him now. He couldn't reach them without explaining why Vijay Gurumoorthy was wandering the margins of the occupation economy, asking about a missing girl. And he couldn't explain that. But he had something he'd never had before. He had resources. He began to pay attention to what those resources could do. The Velhari had a particular relationship to human suffering that Kale had observed inside for 16 years and that now, from this peculiar outside vantage, looked different. They were not cruel in the way that individual cruelty operates, personal, targeted, enjoying itself. They were efficient. The suffering they produced was a byproduct of efficiency, the way exhaust is a byproduct of combustion. They did not hate humans. They had simply calculated that human welfare was not a variable that needed to be optimized. The anti-Bakili program. Kale invented the name from an old temple phrase his mother used to say, meaning roughly against the squeeze, against the slow bleed, began as something small. A warehouse he controlled through VJ's accounts. Human food suppliers he contacted through the gray markets. A distribution point in the transit district, open 3 mornings a week. No identification required, no Vilhari administrative code needed to access it. He hadn't planned it as a program. He had simply started doing what you do when you have resources, and you remember what it felt like not to have them. You open the warehouse. You tell people where it is. The people tell other people. Within 6 weeks, 3,000 humans were using the distribution points. Within 4 months it was 9,000, and there were 7 distribution centers, and he had hired 43 people, and was in the process of building a processing facility for the reclaimed food that the Vilhari logistics hubs wasted. Tons of it, rotting at the edges of the supply chain because the efficiency models didn't account for last-mile distribution to the margins. Erevan was displeased. "This is not what we agreed to," he said, in the conference room of the apartment, with Ilango standing by the door and Shiv Ka attending remotely through a comm link. "You said to maintain VJ's life," Kale said. "I'm maintaining it. You're creating visibility. You're creating a public identity. This wasn't. I know what you wanted." Kale put his hands flat on the table, the way he'd seen administrators do it when they wanted to signal something. "You wanted a puppet. Quiet, compliant, signing documents. You could have that, or you could have this, which is working. Anti-Bakili is working. The humans in this sector now have a reason to maintain the stability of VJ's position, which means your position is more secure, not less. The Vilhari administration doesn't interfere with programs that reduce pressure in the population zones. You know that." Aravan stared at him. There was something in his eyes, an adjustment, a recalibration. He was reclassifying Kale, and Kale could see it happening. "Don't push it," Aravan said. "I know," Kale said. He did not know. But he had understood something critical. The 3 of them needed the appearance of stability more than they needed silence. And he had learned in 16 years of surviving in the margins that the person with the least to lose is always more free than the people managing something precious. He tried to tell a human enforcement officer about the brain transfer. He had to. He needed someone in authority to know, to have it on record somewhere, because he understood by then that the bodies in the ocean would eventually surface. They always did, one way or another. And when they did, he wanted something already in the record that pointed toward the truth. The officer was a man named Madhesh, working out of the Human Compliance Office in the Transit District. He sat across from Kale in an interview room that smelled of recycled air and bureaucratic defeat, and he listened with the specific stillness of a person waiting for a chance to end the conversation. When Kale finished, Madhesh said, "Sir, I understand you've been under considerable stress. I'm telling you the truth, Mr. Gurumurthy. What you're describing is not possible under any technology we're aware of. The Vilhari have been doing it on themselves for decades. The surgeons they use aren't registered with any human administrative body. The procedure leaves markers in the neural tissue. I can tell you exactly where to look. I think what would be best," Madhesh said, "with the practiced gentleness of someone who has learned to shut doors without making noise, is for you to speak with your medical team." He stood up. The interview was over. Walking back through the transit district, Kale passed a woman selling fried food from a cart. She had the look of someone who had been hungry longer than she could calculate. He bought everything she had. He ate none of it. He found a group of children near the culvert that had been his sleeping place before all of this, and he left the food and walked away. It had not gone well. He had known it wouldn't. But the conversation was in Madhesh's record now, and records accumulate. They found the body 7 weeks later. A Vilhari logistics barge running a standard cargo route along the coastal water flagged an anomaly. 3 biological masses, human, sealed in industrial packaging, drifting in a shipping lane. The Vilhari had no particular interest in dead humans, but the disruption to their shipping lane required documentation. And documentation meant the bodies entered the administrative record, and the administrative record was accessible to the Human Compliance Office. And Madhesh pulled it because he was thorough, even when he didn't believe people, and found the 3 names, and remembered a conversation in an interview room that smelled of recycled air. He went to the chief administrator. The chief administrator was a human collaborator named Nanda, a man of perhaps 60, with the particular face of someone who has spent his entire career deciding which humans to protect and which to sacrifice, and who has made peace with this by telling himself it is the best possible outcome of a bad situation. He had the Velhari account information for Aravan, Ilongo, and Shiva, their off-book contracts, their personal financial arrangements with the alien administrators, their history. He brought this to Kale in the conference room, and he laid it on the table, and he said, "I need something from you." "I know," Kale said. "The anti-Bakili accounts, a transfer, 30%. No." Nanda smiled the way people smile when they think they're holding all the cards. "Then I go to the Velhari administration with what I know. An illegal neural transference. An imposter controlling one of the largest human-registered estates in the sector. The legal complications alone would give you nothing," Kale said. "Because you're in the record too, your arrangements with Aravan, your arrangements with the Velhari. I've been doing this for 8 months. I know how to find things. The difference between us is that I'm not protecting anything." The silence that followed had a quality to it he'd felt before. In the scrap markets, in the transit corridors, in the specific moment when both parties in a negotiation realize simultaneously that the math has changed. "Then what do you want?" Nanda said. "Your cooperation, in court." He surrendered himself to the human tribunal on a Tuesday morning. He arrived without counsel. He disclosed the neural transfer, its architects, the documentation he had gathered over 8 months, the names of the Velhari medical personnel who had performed the procedure, the chain of off-book financial transactions that had funded it, the full history of what had been done to him and what he had done in response. The courtroom was a strange place for him. It had the quality of a stage. The formal arrangement of chairs and tables, the human judge in her robes, the public prosecutor who watched him with the controlled fury of someone who has had to construct a legal framework around something that has no legal precedent. He answered every question. He was precise. He had learned in the margins that the most dangerous thing you can be when the system has decided to process you is unclear. What he did not say, because it was not relevant to the tribunal, was how afraid he had been, how the sheer isolation of the first months had sat on him like weight, being surrounded by comfort and resources, and the labor of other humans and still being fundamentally alone, a consciousness wearing a borrowed face, unable to explain himself to anyone. How he had lain awake in the too-soft bed, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of a body that wasn't his and thought about Ronnie, until it was almost a physical sensation, a pressure behind the eyes. He did not say any of that. He answered the questions. He stayed factual and steady. Hema testified on his behalf. She had known, she told the tribunal, for approximately 3 months, had put together the accumulation of small wrongnesses, the gaps, the way he looked at ordinary objects as though seeing them for the first time, the fact that Vijay had never once asked her how she was before this, and this person asked her every morning. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen to help. She was pregnant, and the child was Vijay's, and she had decided that the best thing she could do for the child who would inherit Vijay's name was to ensure that Vijay's name meant something worth inheriting. The tribunal deliberated for 9 days. The judgment was this: Vijay's estate and accounts would transfer to Hema, held in trust for her child. The Anti-Bakili Foundation would be legally independent, its own board, no longer tied to any individual's personal estate. The neural transfer had been performed without Kale's consent, under duress, using illegal Velhari medical technology. This was documented in the record, and would be forwarded to the Occupation Administrative Oversight Body for whatever that was worth. And Kale would serve 10 years in the human detention facility at the Eastern Transit Zone. For the deaths of Aravan, Ilongo, and Shiva, which he did not contest, he stood when the sentence was read. He stood the way you stand when you have accepted a thing entirely, not braced against it, not performing resignation, simply upright, present, finished arguing with reality. They processed him out in the late afternoon, into the holding corridor where the detention transport would come in an hour. A guard brought him the contents of a personal effects box from the estate, items that had been logged as his personal property, No legal challenge possible. There was not much. Some currency chips. A comm unit he would not be permitted to keep, and one other thing, the photograph. He hadn't known Hema had found it. He hadn't known she had kept it. He stood in the holding corridor and looked at his sister's child face, gap-toothed, laughing, and felt something move through him that he didn't have a name for, something that had been compressed and stored for 25 years. And that was right now, very carefully not being examined, because if he started, he would not be able to stop. He folded the photograph along its old crease. He put it in his chest pocket, the one closest. The door at the end of the corridor opened, and a guard said his name, and he turned to go. What happened next was not in any proceeding. It was not recorded. It was a thing that occurred in a corridor in a detention facility with no cameras, between two people who had not spoken before that moment. Ronnie was standing in the doorway. She was 31 years old. She was wearing the kind of clothes that people wear in the administrative sectors, the ones who have moved carefully through the system and found the cracks and worked their way towards something resembling stability. She had a daughter. He would learn this in the next 10 seconds. From the small girl standing just behind her left knee, 3 years old maybe, looking at him with eyes he recognized as his mother's, and a husband who was not here, but who was evidently the kind of man a woman like Ronnie would choose, which meant he was solid and trustworthy, and probably standing somewhere nearby giving them space. Ronnie looked at him. He looked at her. The last time he had seen her, she was 9 years old, and being taken in the dark, and he had screamed until his throat tore. And it had not mattered. She said his name, not Vijay, not the alias, his name, his actual original given name, the one his mother had whispered over a cot in a transit settlement. He said, "I looked for you." "I know," she said. "I know you did. Found the people you asked, the traders, the scavengers." I followed the questions backwards. "How long?" 3 years, before all of this. She gestured vaguely, at the corridor, the facility, the whole incomprehensible sequence of events. "I found where you'd been sleeping, the culvert near the port. You were already gone." He thought about the night the suppression rigs came, the month that had been, the photograph in his pocket. "I have a picture of you," he said. "I've had it for 25 years. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, on the sleeve of the facility issue clothes, and he felt the contact the way you feel the first warmth after a very long cold. Not comfortable yet, but real, undeniably real. The guard said his name again apologetically. He put both hands over his sister's hand. He pressed it once. He looked at the little girl behind her knee, who looked back with his mother's eyes, calm and unafraid, the way small children sometimes are in the presence of things that confuse adults. "What's her name?" he asked. Ronnie smiled. The gap in her teeth was gone, grown in, sometime in the 22 years between, but the smile was the same. He knew it from the photograph, and he knew it from somewhere older than the photograph. "Sathya," she said. He was quiet for a moment. 10 years, he said. "I'll be out in 10 years. "I'll be here," she said. "We'll be here." He nodded. He turned toward the door. He did not look back, because if he had, he would not have been able to walk through it, and walking through it was the correct thing to do, was the only correct thing. Treat the final act of a long sequence that had begun in a culvert and run through a borrowed body and a warehouse full of food and a courtroom, and arrived here, at this door, where the right answer was to go through it and let the years pass and come out the other side. He walked through. The Anti-Bikili Foundation did not dissolve in his absence. This surprised the people who had predicted it would. They had not accounted for the 43 people he had hired, or the distribution networks those 43 people had built, or the 11 community storage facilities that had been established in the transit zones, or the fact that when you give humans who have been invisible a structure through which they can become visible to each other, they tend to hold on to it with a tenacity that surprises everyone who didn't need it. By the end of the first year of Kale's detention, the Foundation had 312 paid staff and approximately 7,000 volunteers. By the end of the third year, it had been programs in enforced sectors and had been formally recognized by the Human Administrative Oversight Body, which gave it legal standing to negotiate directly with the Velhari logistics operations for the reclaimed food that was otherwise wasted. The Velhari approved the arrangement. It improved their efficiency numbers. In the fourth year, a Velhari senior administrator, a high caste functionary named something that translated approximately as resonance of deep waiters, submitted a formal inquiry to the Neural Transfer Research Division of the Velhari Medical Corps. The inquiry asked, on the record, why a human consciousness subjected to forced transfer, operating in an unfamiliar body, with no institutional support and no legal standing, had, within 8 months, constructed a effective poverty mitigation program than the Velhari administrative apparatus had managed in 60 years of occupation. The research division's response was a citation of the depth resonance metric. The administrator's response to the response was a recommendation that the depth resonance metric be studied more carefully and that the assumption of human intellectual inferiority embedded in the standard resource allocation model be reviewed. This was not, in the end, the revolution. Revolutions in the Velhari administrative structure happened slowly, over decades, and had more to do with internal efficiency pressures than with any human action. But the inquiry was in the record, and records accumulate. In his cell in the Eastern Transit Zone facility, Cale did not spend his time thinking about legacy. He was not that kind of person. He thought about Ronnie, and about the small girl with his mother's eyes, and about the 10 years as a concrete quantity of time, a distance to be walked. He thought about the warehouse, and the people who had come to the distribution centers, and the woman selling fried food from a cart, and the children near the culvert. He had a single permitted personal item in his cell, not the comm unit, the photograph. He had pinned it to the wall at eye level, which is the height at which you look at things you want to remember. Some of the other people in the facility, humans who had committed various violations of the Occupation Administrative Code, which was a large and accommodating category, knew who he was. Word moved in detention the way it moves everywhere that desperate people share space. He did not cultivate the reputation. He did not discourage it either. He answered questions when they were asked. He was precise. He stayed factual and steady. A man named Selvum, who had been running a gray market water reclamation operation in the Southern Transit Zone, and who was 6 years into an 8-year term, asked him once, in the common area, what had made him surrender, had made him walk into the tribunal voluntarily when he could theoretically have continued indefinitely. Cale thought about it for a while. Because it was over, he said, what I needed to do. The bodies were going to surface. The documentation was going to reach the oversight body eventually, with or without me. The only thing I could control was what the record said when it happened. You traded freedom for the record, Selvum said. I traded freedom for a foundation that's feeding 9,000 people. And for my sister knowing where I am, Cale said. The record was part of it, but that's not why. Selvum was quiet. You're not what I expected, he said finally. I know, Cale said. People keep saying that. The Velhari did not understand humans. This was their central miscalculation, and it was not a failure of intelligence. They were extraordinarily intelligent, as measured by any standard they applied. It was a failure of imagination. They had looked at humanity and seen biological fragility, short lifespan, emotional volatility, tribal organization, inefficient resource use, limited technological development. They had calculated, manageable. They had proceeded accordingly. What they had not calculated was what grief does to a consciousness over time. What it does to a mind that has spent 25 years carrying a thing it could not set down. They had identified depth resonance as a useful medical property. They had not understood it as a quality of character. They had not understood that the same pressure that makes a mind amenable to neural transfer also makes it capable of extraordinary lateral thinking, extraordinary patience, extraordinary willingness to endure. They had kidnapped a man from a culvert. They had put him in a body with resources and a platform. They had expected a puppet. What they had produced, without intending to, was a man who already knew how to survive with nothing and had just been handed something. This was, in the end, the nature of the thing. The Velhari had run their calculation and found a beggar, disposable, controllable, a zero in their accounting. What they had not accounted for was what a man who has spent his life being invisible knows about the world that the visible people miss. What he has learned to read in silence. what he can build in the gaps between what is being watched. They had not accounted for the photograph, 25 years of carrying it. The fact that a man who has held on to one thing through everything is not a man who lets things go. They had taken everything from him. They had not thought to count love, because love does not appear in efficiency models. It does not register in logistical projections. It does not show up in neural profile assessments, except as a faint signature that makes transfer easier. They had not thought to count it because it had no number. And so they had not understood that what they were looking at, when they looked at him in the culvert, in the transit corridors, in the scrap heaps at the edge of their infrastructure, what they were looking at was not a zero. It was a foundation. The Anti-Bikili Foundation. 11 distribution centers, 312 paid staff, 7,000 volunteers. Ronnie, alive. A small girl with his mother's eyes. Sathya. 10 years a concrete distance, a thing to be walked. He looked at the photograph on the wall of his cell, the laughing child, the gap-toothed smile. He thought, I am coming, he thought. We were never small as you thought we were, he thought. We never were. Outside, the facility yard was quiet in the way that only large enclosed spaces can be quiet. A held breath, sounds absorbed by walls before they could become echoes. A handful of other detainees moved through the exercise corridor in the last of the afternoon light, unhurried, each absorbed in whatever internal landscape they had constructed to make the time passable. Kale sat on a low concrete bench against the east wall and watched the light change. It was something he had learned to do in the scrap heaps and the transit corridors. Pay attention to light, to the particular quality of each hour. The Velhari lighting infrastructure operated on a different spectrum than natural sunlight, colder and more even, and the transition between natural and artificial as the day ended was something humans in the occupied zones experienced as a kind of atmospheric shift, a change in the texture of the air. He had always noticed it. He noticed it here too. He was thinking about infrastructure, specifically about the water reclamation question Selvam had raised 3 weeks ago. KL had turned over and over. Since then, the way you turn a problem when you have nothing but time. The Southern Transit Zone's gray market water operation had been shut down, but the need it was addressing hadn't been shut down with it. 9,000 households in the zone were still accessing water through an intermediary network that was nominally within Velhari administrative code, but was genuinely fragile. A single audit could collapse it. The foundation had legal standing now. Legal standing meant you could make formal applications to the Velhari Logistics Board for resource access. The question was the framing. The Velhari Logistics Board responded to efficiency arguments, not humanitarian ones. If you came to them with a proposal that reduced waste in their distribution chain, while incidentally providing clean water to 9,000 human households, they would approve it. If you came to them asking for help with 9,000 human households, they would route the request into an administrative holding queue, where it would remain until it became someone else's problem. He thought about this for a while. He didn't have a comm unit. He didn't have administrative access to anything. What he had was a legal pad that the facility permitted, a reasonable supply of pencils, and the fact that Selvam had 9 months left on his term and was going to need something to do when he got out. He went back inside and found Selvam in the common area and said, I've been thinking about your water problem. Selvam looked at him. I thought you said it was over, he said. The foundation, your role in it, my administrative role, my ability to make decisions, that's over for 10 years. Kale sat down across from him. But I can think, and I can write things down. And in 9 months, you're going to walk out of here, and you're going to need work. The foundations will need people who understand the Southern Zone's logistics infrastructure. You understand it better than anyone they currently have. Selvam was quiet for a moment. You're building from inside a cell, he said. I've been building from harder places than this, Kale said. He handed Selvam the first page of the legal pad. He'd already started. The Velhari Logistics Board approved a water reclamation proposal in the 7th month of Kale's first year, 18 months before Selvam's release. Selvam was involved in none of it, technically. Kale was involved in none of it, technically. The proposal had been drafted by the Foundation's new operations director. A woman named Poon Go Dee, who had been running a transit zone clinic for 8 years and who had met Kale at a distribution center 2 weeks before his surrender, and who had accepted the operations role with the calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of work without knowing it. The documentation on which the proposal was based had originated 3 months earlier from a handwritten analysis on a legal pad in the Eastern Transit Zone facility. How it had gotten to Pungudi's desk was a matter of several informal handoffs through the visiting process that the facility allowed on alternating Sundays. The facility's records showed that during this period, Kale had no contact with anyone from the Foundation, no access to communication technology, no administrative involvement in any external organization. The facility's records were accurate. They were also, in the specific sense that mattered, incomplete. This was something Kale had understood since the culvert. Systems see what they're designed to see. Efficiency models account for the variables they're built to track. Falls outside the model. The handwritten page, the Sunday visit. The knowledge that travels in human memory between one person and another doesn't register. It doesn't get counted. He had lived his whole life in what didn't get counted. He was still there. The years moved. He learned their texture. Year 1 had the quality of adjustment, of the mind resettling into constraint after the compressed intensity of the previous 18 months. Year 2 was the year he read everything the facility library had. Legal texts mostly. The administrative code of the occupation. The formal structure of the treaty agreements. Technical documentation that the Velhari had made publicly available on resource allocation models. He was looking for gaps. He found several. He wrote them down. Year 3 was the water proposal year. Year 4 was quieter. Year 5 brought a new intake of detainees from the Warrant Corridor crackdown, including a young man named Velu, who had been running a children's literacy program in defiance of the Velhari educational restriction codes, and who sat in the common area on his first day, with the particular blankness of someone who has just had their entire life removed from them. And Kale sat across from him and asked what he needed, and Velu said he needed it to mean something. And Kale said, "Yes, I understand that completely," then explained the gap he had found in the Velhari educational restriction code. It was a small gap, technical, having to do with the classification of certain types of information transfer as logistical documentation rather than educational content. Gaps are gaps, and a small gap in the right place is a door. Velu walked out of the facility in Year 7 with 2 years remaining on his term, converted to supervised release, having provided the oversight body with a full technical analysis of the Velhari Educational Restriction Code and its internal contradictions, which analysis became the basis of a formal challenge that would wind through the administrative review process for 11 years, outlasting the original restriction code and eventually producing a revised educational access framework that was quietly, carefully, structurally better. Kale was not cited in any of that. Velu was cited accurately as the primary author. The analysis was Velu's. Kale had just shown him the gap. This was how he spent the years. Not patiently exactly. Patience suggests waiting for something to happen. This was more like the way a river moves through stone. Not waiting, not in a hurry, simply persistent, always finding the low ground, always moving. On the morning of the first day of his 10th year, which was also the last year, the year with the release date at the end of it, Kale woke up before the facility lights came on, in the gray pre-dawn that leaked through the narrow window, and lay still and thought about his mother. He didn't think about her often. It was too large. She had died in the transit settlement when he was 14, one of the ordinary deaths that the occupation produced in large numbers. Inadequate access to medical care, a condition that would have been manageable with resources they didn't have. He had been present, and there had been nothing to do. She had said his name at the end, and then Ronnie's name, and then she had stopped. He lay in the gray light, and he let himself think about her for a while. Not the end before the end. The settlement, the cot, the sound of her voice in the mornings. The way she used to say the phrase his name for the foundation had come from. Against the squeeze, against the slow bleed, when the rations didn't stretch, and she was trying to figure out how to feed 2 children on almost nothing. Not complaining. Working the problem aloud. he thought. I am still working the problem, he thought. She would have found that funny. Specific kind of funny that is almost the same as crying. The lights came on. He got up. He folded the photograph, which he had kept for 25 years, and would keep for whatever years were left, and put it in his chest pocket. He went to wash his face. He thought about Ronnie and her daughter, and the release date at the end of the year, which was a concrete distance, a thing to be walked. He was still walking.